think your talk leads us really nicely into Yasmin's talk because it really carries the themes of the sort of post-9/11 hysteria and the way it's targeted what are called populations of interest. And so please.
Okay, that's a really hard act to follow. But anyway, I'm going to try. I'd like to begin by thanking President Woodsworth, Associate Dean Graham Carr, and the organizers of the series for inviting me here today and to present. And I want to focus on, sort of take off on what Tim just presented, which is this whole notion of a culture of fear. We're actually living in a culture of fear, and this is very much linked to privacy and security, which is what I'm going to be focusing on, but I want to pay particular attention to the issue of racial profiling. Now, I don't normally read, but I'm going to read a little bit because I've got a lot to pack in. But before I do that, I really want to take this opportunity to thank my graduate students who are here and who have been so instrumental in helping me put this presentation together and my other presentations today. So I want to start out by saying that studies have shown that people who are heavy consumers of the media tend to be more fearful and tend to have a very pessimistic outlook on the world. Now, there isn't a causality established in these studies, but they do suggest to us that through cultivation, through time, people actually are more fearful when they've consumed a lot of media. And when you think about it, according to American studies, an average child in the 1990s witnesses 18,000 murders on television by the time he or she is 18. That's not to say that every child commits a murder, but we are all aware of murders, and even though we may not know a murderer or have encountered one face to face, the very knowledge of what constitutes murder and having a preconception of a murderer is something that's fed to us by the media. So I want to look at the culture of fear that is amplified by the media and that has spiraled to the point where we rationalize and legitimize state and other forms of surveillance. But I want to complicate this by talking about the inverse strategy that we engage in, namely laying bare or making transparent aspects of our public lives, our private lives for public consumption. And I love alliterations, so I've actually come up with an alliteration for this event. And this alliteration is based on the 4 Ps. At the bottom is the big P, which I call power. And out of these emanate 3 other Ps. One is property, the second one is propriety, and the third one is privacy. And so I'm going to link these 3 Ps to this big P at the bottom. And like I said, I love alliterations. Surveillance is not new. What has made surveillance more widely encompassing and a threat to privacy is the consolidated nature of the information that is now being collected. From passports, driver's licenses, medical cards, to the pre-flight information gathered by airlines, banks, insurance companies, businesses, credit card companies, and so forth. All of this results in a vast data bank of knowledge about any individual person, which, given the technologies that now exist, can be cross-tabulated, referenced, and stored in a way as to generate a profile of the person. Indeed, even computer email accounts like Google store this information. I'm a firm believer in the oral tradition, and so if my PowerPoint diverges in one direction from my talk, just listen to my talk. Okay? But as the experience in China has shown, companies like Google can also monitor their clients and can also relay that information to state authorities. So it's this point of consolidation and these tie-ins that I want to bring to the forefront. Philosopher Michel Foucault described at length the power of the Panopticon in his book Discipline and Punish. He argued that through disciplinary technologies such as the imposition of ordered lives, punctuated by regimes of conduct and discipline through supervision, individuals over time learn to abide by the structures imposed on them, They, in fact, internalize the discipline. Foucault put all of this in a more elegant and complicated way than I am doing here. But the point that individuals internalize that discipline so as to become docile citizens of the state is what needs to be emphasized. These technologies today include the mass media. News and crime stories in particular afford us as the audience what Jack Katz has called morality plays, delivering us to us images of what Himani Banerjee has aptly termed images of prescription and description, prescribing and describing the ways one should act, the normative values we're expected to abide by, and so forth. These images also describe a world out there, outlining for us those who are different from us. In essence, these stories are the contemporary fables of the day, again delineating the moral boundaries of society and identifying those who fit in and those who are the stigmatized others. They constitute the norms of propriety, behaviors and values that underpin the moral order. So that's one of my P's. So here is the Panopticon, where the few see the many. In the Panopticon that Foucault describes, and he draws his model from Jeremy Bentham, slide, the Panopticon is a surveillance structure that is part of a prison. It towers over the prison and houses the guards. These guards are able to look into the cells of the prisoner and observe each prisoner. And while the guards are able to scrutinize the prisoners, they remain invisible to them. In the Panopticon that's up there, you can see where the cells are, where the Panopticon is. This is, you can't see my pointer, but where the little windows are. But also this structure here, which now allows one to view all the way around so that you can see in, but the part at the bottom cannot see into the top. This is the power of invisibility of the dominant gaze. Thomas Mathiasson argues that with the mass media, we actually have a two-way effect. The Panopticon is complemented and supplemented by the synopticon, and the synopticon is exemplified by the mass media. In contrast to the Panopticon, where the few guards see the many prisoners, in the Panopticon, the many see the few. A good example of this is the coverage of celebrities in the mass media. We, as the audience, the many, are able to see the few. Through the kinds of tabloids that we purchase at the grocery store, or through programs like Entertainment Tonight or its equivalent, we get to gaze into the lives of the few and voyeuristically share in their successes and their downfalls. The synopticon also functions in the form of things like Facebook, where we reveal all for the many, those who we wish to have participate in our lives, as well as those anonymous others who we invite or leave ourselves open to. The synopticon, too, is tied to the proprietary function, one of the P's, in laying out the moral order, by demonstrating the transgressions that happen. And here I want to draw in the work that I've been doing and the course that I've been teaching on crime in the media, where crime stories, particularly stories that you see on television, become ways in which we, as the audience, are shown the kinds of crimes that are considered crimes, the very construction of crime and its definition. But we're also shown what happens to criminals. So the idea is we get to learn how to police ourselves. While the Panopticon functions like the Big Brother, emblematizing the role of surveillance technologies, the synopticon can be regarded as a response, and some might even view it as an oppositional response, such as hacking. Others might see it as the ultimate achievement of a disciplined society, being so internalized that we, without caution, or perhaps with some caution, leave ourselves open to scrutiny. The rationale we are provided, and which we in turn provide others, is that we have nothing to hide. The binary between the Panopticon and the synopticon conceals the power relations that underpin it. While we as citizens might feel that we exercise some power over the kinds of revelations we might make about ourselves, in places like Facebook or posting things about ourselves on YouTube, the reality is that the corporations that govern these sites and the state as a whole has more power than we do. How that information is to be used and how it is even framed are the issues that should concern us. In whose interest is that information used and to whose benefit? And the interesting thing is that while those of us who engage in the synopticon are laying our lives bare, these same corporations are becoming more and more guarded in the kinds of information they possess and the use to which they put it. And I'm thinking here particularly of patent laws and copyright, which actually forbids me to show many of the images that I wanted to show. In the context of contemporary society post 9/11, the issues of security have gained a heightened salience as a direct outcome of the war on terror, as my colleague Tim has shown. We have been told in numerous ways that we need to give up our rights to privacy and individual liberties in the name of security. The pivotal question that has been posed in numerous venues is how to balance security and liberty. Legal scholar Lucia Zedner, whose quote I have up here, has observed that liberty is commonly presented as a left liberal project and security as a conservative one. And I want you to bear this in mind given how much politics in the contemporary day and age has veered more to the right than to the left or the center. And David Althide, in his extensive work on mediated fear, suggests that how liberty or individual privacy is even conceptualized is problematic. He notes that once the discourse of the war on terror was launched, the climate it created did not allow for any kind of critical interrogation or analysis of the issue. In fact, those that did articulate a critique were severely chastised, and there was a chill. Rather, individual liberties, he said, it was felt had to be necessarily compromised in the name of security. And he notes how even those who advocated for individual liberties were labeled, quote, privacy advocates, as if they represented a lobby group or a special interest group, rather than articulating the concerns of the citizen. So, as Zedner argues, the more ill-defined the threat, the greater the potential to top the balance in favor of tougher security measures, to detain and hold suspects on the slightest of grounds, to carry out covert searches, and to suspend normal protections associated with due process and a fair trial. The threat of terrorism, as that rooted in amorphous terror cells spread across both Canada and the US, has been widely articulated in numerous media formats, ranging from TV news documentaries to popular films and television crime dramas, as, for example, the infamous 24 and its Canadian counterpart, The Border, aired on CBC. We are, as Althide puts it, primed for any future attacks. We know the language, we are inculcated in reading the signs, and we are state to provide these requisite solutions through the passage of such legislation as the Anti-Terrorism Act. Zedner again raises the problematic issue of how balancing is represented or presented as a zero-sum game, in which more of one necessarily means less of the other, which means that if we are to have security, we necessarily have to give up on privacy. But is it a zero-sum game? Have we actually ever had a robust measure of privacy? Or is privacy, as Professor McSheffrey points out, merely confined to the domestic sphere, using Trudeau's famous dictum, the bedrooms of the nation? And is privacy merely a luxury that only a few, those with property, my other P, are entitled to? Most of the literature in the area of risk assessment suggests that this is not a science, that there is no certainty or guarantee, and that whatever little assurance is to be gained is not strong enough to warrant the kinds of sacrifices that are asked of us in terms of compromising on our individual liberties. But let me go back to the use of information that has been gleaned as a result of the shedding of whatever veils of privacy we might have had. What happens to that information should it be consolidated in a way as to generate specific profiles? The widespread use of racial profiling is based on selective interpretations of this kind of cumulative information predicated on the stereotypes that abound in the common stock of knowledge. There has been considerable debate about racial profiling in terms of police response. However, studies conducted in Toronto and elsewhere have demonstrated that racial profiling is a persistent activity amongst police forces across the country. In a broad sense, and here I want to quote, racial profiling refers to police action that relies on stereotypes about race, color, ethnicity, religion, or place of origin rather than the behavior or other reason for suspicion. This is a, end quote. This is a definition put forward by William Kloss, who is the chief of the Kingston Police Services, a force that has been recognized as engaging in racial profiling. Since the unleashing of the War on Terror, racial profiling has gained momentum on the streets and in the skies. The no-fly list that most airlines adhere to is based on a profile of those who are considered potential or actual terror threats. There are numerous stories of how those with the wrong name have been profiled and prevented from flying. Professor Schwab's presentation reveals how even the name of an enemy constitutes a kind of profiling. And here I want to sort of bring in a little story that Shirin Razak, a colleague of mine, wrote about. And it was about an email that she had received from a Muslim scholar, yes please, who had written to her. And what had happened to this scholar, who was at a well-established, prestigious university, is that he had been outside tearing up some of his garbage and putting it into the sort of bin. And he and another young man had observed him doing this. And this was on a Saturday morning. So this young man called the police and said that there was suspicious activity going on. Thank you. And that this Middle Eastern-looking professor was shredding this, what could be information that was very valuable. Well, of course, you know, the professor gets arrested and detained, and it turns out that all he was doing was just, you know, trashing, putting out some trash. And in the context of this story, Professor Razak notes that had this man not been a citizen, and had he been traveling to, had he in his recent period traveled to either Pakistan or Afghanistan, he would have been arrested and detained and would have been held as a terror suspect without any recourse to any kind of law. So she describes this as an example of being Muslim while trashing your garbage. And it's a very apt description. Racial profiling also occurs amongst the population, and this was the reason why I say this story, that it's not just confined to the police, it's actually racial profiling done by the public at large, because we've been inculcated with the threat of this terror, and the idea is we have to now look upon each other as potential suspects. After 9/11, there were numerous threats against Arab students, even here at Concordia. In one case, a Saudi woman nursing student at McGill was accosted in the hospital elevator and her hijab forcibly removed. One of my grad students, Kenza, who's here, was commenting on this, and she said, well, what happened? All that happened is that all the women faculty or interning students were basically then put on a rotation that did not involve any night security or any night shifts, and they had to work in the daytime. And that was basically all that happened. And I remember at that time thinking, wow, if a number of powerful, rich businessmen were to have had, or any one of them, say a well-known personality, to have this kind of thing happened in an elevator, what then would be the response? Well, the RCMP would have been called in, he might have been given a personal security guard, but not so with these women. Hate crimes in this aftermath increased. Of the 338 incidents that were reported, 121 were directly linked to September 11th. And as the authors of one Canadian study put it, the biggest leap in reported hate crimes was against Muslims, Arabs, Sikhs, Hindus, South Asians, Africans, and anybody who appeared to look like a Middle Eastern Muslim. The Council on American Islamic Relations and Canadian Muslim Civil Liberties Association recorded 110 incidents of harassment, threats, death threats, attacks on personal property, physical assaults, and attempts to burn down Islamic centers and places of worship in the 2 months following 9/11. Hardly any of this, by the way, was reported in the press. In the US, the FBI reported that anti-Muslim crimes rose by a dramatic 1,600% between 2001 and 2003. Law scholar Green Badi argues that in the aftermath of 9/11, race became proxy for risk. So, the consequences of racial profiling are many. The example of Maher Arer is a case in point. Arrested and diverted to Syria, where he was tortured on the basis of allegations of being tied to terrorist networks, Maher was subsequently cleared of all charges, and this is after considerable advocacy on the part of his wife, Mona Mazik. The recent release of Adil Cherkaoui also demonstrates how profiling can be dangerous in terms of imprisoning or incarcerating those against whom the evidence is weak, inadequate, or unverifiable. And the Cherkaoui case points to the reality that since 2001, 6 Muslim men have been issued security certificates and jailed on the basis of their presumed intent with no public evidence made available. We know now that the Security Act or the Anti-Terrorism Act was struck down. And that in itself is very revealing. But what's also disheartening is that the Supreme Court that struck this act down then gave this conservative government 1 year to redraft the act and to come up with something else. In 2003, the RCMP, along with state authorities, apprehended at gunpoint 23 South Asian men, many of whom were in bed sleeping at the time. The men were arrested on charges of engaging in terrorist activity. None were, but 21 were deported. Operation Thread, as it was called, and there's a documentary that my friend Arshad has made. It's called Threadbare, and it really traces how this was such a bare operation, seemed to pivot around some pretty flimsy evidence. Aside from ridiculous things like the fact that these men had pictures of the CN Tower, they were all touring that area. And that they had, maps, again, a common thing amongst tourists. The fact is that most of these men were named Muhammad. So there you go. Name becomes another way in which threat becomes codified. And in 2006, there was another group that was arrested, the Toronto 18. Again, the common factor was Muslim identity. Muslims, Professor Shiraz Dosa points out, have been constructed as lethal entities. In the immediate aftermath of the arrest of the 18, journalist Robert Fisk wrote in The Independent that the national Canadian press coverage, quote, indulge in an orgy of finger-pointing that must reduce the chances of any fair trial and, at the same time, sow fear in the hearts of the country's more than 700,000 Muslims. In fact, he says, if I were a Canadian Muslim right now, I'd be checking the airline timetables for a flight out of town. End quote. Unfortunately for Fisk, if he went to the airport, likely his and if his name was Muhammad, he'd be on a no-fly list. Against the backdrop of this profiling, those who are not profiled but belong to the same communities are deemed to be good and law-abiding, as fitting in the, quote, moderate Muslims that we seem to hear so much about and have heard so much about, particularly with the reasonable accommodation hearings. We never ask someone or define a person as a moderate Christian. And as Professor Letty Wolpe has argued in the case of the Oklahoma bombings in 1993, Timothy McVeigh, who was responsible for it, did not produce a discourse about good whites and bad whites, because we think of him as an individual deviant, a bad actor. We do not think of his actions as representative of an entire social group. Now, I want to end by pointing out that while the synopticon that we engage in, the Facebook, YouTube, or whatever technologies we use to share aspects of ourselves and our lives is based on our voluntary decision to share information, the Panopticon is not. It is information extracted, often by coercion, sometimes through soft power, as in persuasion, and other times through interrogation and the threat of criminalization. Perhaps this distinction is too fluid, in that because in the end, we are compelled to share information whether we like it or not. The hard power of the state and its various policing arms, the RCMP, CSIS, border security, etc., makes themselves felt very tangibly in this equation. If we return to the notion of balance, then we need to ask ourselves whether indeed our privacy and individual liberties are worth protecting, or whether in fact we prefer to live in a police state with Big Brother, so as to ensure our safety from threats that seem to come up in so many different guises, from the H1N1 flu to global terrorism. And we need to ask ourselves whether in fact we ever had the kind of privacy we seem to aspire to or reminisce about as the hallmark of the, quote, good old days, or whether privacy itself is an illusion, a false sense of security confined either to the domestic sphere of our homes or to those with enough material, power, and property to guarantee themselves shields against the public gaze. And if the threat to our security is embodied in these lethal Muslims, then what are we to make of the Muslim woman out there in Afghanistan or elsewhere? Are they then the worthy victims deserving of our benevolence to be rescued from barbaric Muslim men and to be made into our own? And how are we to construe our interventions in their countries in light of the 4 Ps: power, property, propriety, and privacy? If property is land or country, and propriety the moral governing or liberation of Muslim women, then whose privacy are we really talking about? If we think about the corporations that profited from the invasion in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq, then we can better situate the lack of privacy and the glare of the Western press on those with little or no power. And I want to end with this pithy quote from Iris Marion Young. She says, quote, "To the extent that citizens of a democratic state allow their leaders to adopt a stance of protectors toward them, these citizens come to occupy a subordinate status like that of women in the patriarchal household," end quote. And if that patriarchal household is simply Islam and the women and Muslim women, then what does that make of us and our relationship to the state and to issues of its interventions in our privacy? Thank you.